and that'll come through our website. So you don't have to stay here all day and all night, because we've got people from right across the world. And at the end of today, we'll be having a quick look at where you've all come from, which is really interesting, but it is genuinely a global audience. So in this second lot of presentations today, we're going to be hearing from Patrick Lloyd in the first case. This is Patrick on the screen here. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Patrick. Patrick is a licensed master social worker. He was the first public library social worker in Texas, previously serving in the Georgetown, Texas Public Library, and as a community resilience consultant for the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. He is a former co-chair of the Public Library Association Social Worker Task Force. Currently, Patrick works as a clinical assistant professor at the University of Texas, Steve Hicks School of Social Work. Patrick has presented at the annual conferences of several library and social work organisations, as well as for information professionals all over the United States and now all over the world. He lives in Georgetown, Texas with a grumpy beagle, which we're hoping to get a little cameo performance from. And the title of his presentation, as you can see, is A Light in the Dark, Courage, Protection and the Public Library. So as Patrick starts to talk, if you do have questions for him, please put them in the Q&A section there. If you would just like to talk to each other and have a bit of a chat, then please use the chat feature. The questions that we ask of Patrick will come from the Q&A listing there. So if you do want Patrick to address something, please pop it in the Q&A section. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Patrick. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. And thank you also to Karen, Casey, Monique, and Sabine, and CSU for the invitation to be here with all of you this evening. Thank you all for being here, particularly to those of you who may have been up in the middle of the night watching the Socceroos advance to the next round of the World Cup. Big thumbs up from Jane. I'm a soccer fan myself, so I was watching that match this morning, my time, and knowing that I was speaking to this audience, I was pleased to see that. So I'll be rooting for y'all until you meet the US 2 games from now, because if we both win on Saturday, then we will cross paths. But anyway, thank you all for being here. My name is Patrick. I am a social worker here in Texas in the US. But before we jump into everything, I do want to give a quick heads up that this talk will feature some unfortunate discussion of racism, specifically related to people of Asian descent, especially Chinese folks. So I just want to give a heads up there. And I'm also going to be saying some hard stuff about library administration. And this is not meant to be a personal attack. It is true to my experience as a library social worker here in the US. My hope is that the talk that I'm about to deliver is just a crazy story that you tell your friends that will not make any sense to you as you engage in any work in this area in libraries. I hope that this does not speak to your experience, but it very well may. And so with that, let's jump in. So goals for this morning, if you're in Australia, this evening, and if you're in the US, I'm going to share a disappointing story, like I said, and I want to talk about protecting library patrons, especially vulnerable library patrons. I consider the public library, all libraries, but especially the public library, to be a protective factor in the lives of vulnerable people, especially. I'm going to be talking about courage, which may seem a strange topic when we're here talking about social work in libraries, but I think that Beth Waller's talk that we just watched laid some important groundwork in how the reframing of library work to a trauma-informed perspective, to an anti-racist perspective, to an equitable perspective is hard work. And it requires pushing back on, here, as you see here, the way we've always done it, or pushing back on the status quo. How are we going to convince powerful people that we should be able to spend tax dollars in becoming anti-racist and becoming trauma-informed? That takes courage. And unfortunately, I don't see enough of it within libraries, particularly from library administrators, in my experience here in the States. And I'm going to do my best to get us some time for Q&A. It's a tight window, but I think we should have some time. So just a little bit more about me. There you can see Coach. Hopefully he will join us live and in the flesh at some point, but he's an older guy, so he may be snoozing on the couch right now, but there he is. A little bit more about me. I've been a social worker for 10 years, but I've been doing helping professional work since 2005. Before I moved into libraries and now teaching, I was a school social worker and I worked in child welfare. I think, and a through line for those of you who work in libraries or in schools for that matter, that I've seen when I worked in schools, when I worked in libraries, and of course as a social worker, is that teachers, librarians, and social workers, all of our work is at its best, in my opinion, when we are driving towards empowerment. And I think that folks who do those jobs well are really pushing their clients, their students, their patrons in a direction where hopefully they will begin to be able to solve their problems independently. And I think that really unites those three professions in my experience. I became a library social worker in 2016. I had never heard of library social work when I got that job. That is a story that is too long to tell this morning, but y'all will have my email at the end of this, and I encourage you please to shoot me an email anytime. I'm happy to talk. I was a founding member of the sadly now defunct Public Library Association Social Worker Task Force. That is also a longer story as regarding the demise of that group. I do think it speaks to the topic today, but again, we don't exactly have a lot of time to dive into it completely. In 2021, I worked for the state of Texas at the State Library in a new position called Community Resilience Consultant. I was really excited to take that position, but I ran into a lot of challenges. And I was only in it for a year as I was hired as a professor at the University of Texas at Austin at the School of Social Work, something that I love teaching, and I was very happy to move into that position. And frankly, I think the Texas State Library was very happy to have me move into that position as well, for reasons that may become clear over the next 45 minutes. So I want to start with an unfortunate story. Many of our libraries have story time, and I'm going to have one right now, but this story is unfortunately not a happy one. So I want to take us back in time to October 2020. And if we were a smaller group, I would ask you to tell me what was going on in October 2020. But since we're a large group, I won't do that. But of course, this was in the midst of the pandemic at its height. There was, here in America, in the United States, there were violence in the streets, protests every Saturday night. We were in the midst also of a contentious presidential election. And there was something in the news, something that continues to happen, unfortunately, and is not in the news as much as it was at this time. But in October 2020, there were frequent instances of racist violence against people of Asian descent across the globe, and especially here in the United States. And so I want you to keep this context in mind as I show you some emails, some anonymized emails from this period of time when I was working in a library. I should back up. It's important to also note that in October 2020, my library was working in person. We went back to work in person on May 1st, 2020. In October 2020, we were also allowing volunteers into the building as well. That was probably goes without saying, not my decision, but back to work in person, and there are volunteers in the building. And October 20th, 2020, I was at my desk and I heard a volunteer from about 25 feet away and over the walls of 2 cubicles say to a staff person, "That's another reason I hate the Chinese." He didn't say, "I hate China." He didn't say, "I hate the Chinese government." He said, "I hate the Chinese." I considered this hate speech, and I still do. I wrote this email, I documented it, and wrote this email that you see here, sent it to our volunteer coordinator and our library director. The response I received immediately, almost immediately, was from our volunteer coordinator, who was a wonderful person and took the bull by the horns and spoke to what I consider to be this racist volunteer, whose name was Colin, about what he had said. To her credit, I heard her do it because, again, I was within earshot of this man. Unfortunately, at that point in time, the volunteer coordinator who wrote this email was not empowered to remove that volunteer. And so, hearing nothing from my library director about this incident, the next day, I emailed the library director with what you see here. And I said, it's my strong recommendation that Colin be removed as a volunteer. It's my understanding he has a history of similar issues, which is true, of course. And he's in violation of the organization's policy regarding a professional work environment, which you can read here, which I do think he violated. But this policy is, in my opinion, vague and somewhat toothless, unfortunately. And as you can see, I asked the director and I've also been working at this library at this point for almost 4 years. And I said, I'd like to know what, if any, behavioral policies we have regarding volunteers and racist language and harassment. This incident did recall a previous incident that we had experienced with ongoing sexual harassment of a woman on staff by another volunteer that went on for far too long before he was removed, which I noted as well. This email continues. If we don't have those policies, I want to be involved in creating those policies. Furthermore, this library at the time was promoting How to Be an Anti-Racist, a book by Ibram X. Kendi, which some of you are probably familiar with. And in that book, Kendi essentially says that racist and non-racist, or I'm sorry, racist and anti-racist is a binary. You cannot be in the middle. You're either anti-racist or you're racist. At that time, my library was promoting this book actively. We were also attempting to begin a campaign called All Are Welcome in our library. And as you can see here, I thought that there was a real discrepancy between our words and our behavior. And as Beth pointed out, one of the tenets of trauma-informed care is trustworthiness. And are we saying what we say we're going to do? And we were not doing it. And as you can see here, I told the director of that, and that essentially that if we allowed this person to continue as a volunteer, then our institution was racist. And finally, that director responded and said that he was not ready to remove that volunteer. He did think that we should have clear policies in dealing with volunteers and this sort of issue. And it's important to note here that this person had been the library director for over 20 years. And so to say that this person thought that we needed clear policies, I just want you to know that this is someone who had plenty of opportunity to have created these policies, and they did not exist. Let me back up. So it's October 2020. Nothing happens after this email exchange. I ended up reporting this entire incident to the HR department and the Human Resources department. To my knowledge, nothing happened there either. This director ended up retiring in January 2021. I think in part due to people on staff, myself included, holding their feet to the fire in regards to staff safety, regarding COVID, in regards to issues like this. And that person retired in January 2021. And the assistant director was promoted to director. And I went to that person and I said, do you know about this history of Colin, the volunteer? And that this new director said no. And I forwarded them this email exchange, and I received this response. That this director spoke to the volunteer coordinator for some information, and she understands my point about striving for anti-racism, but she's of the opinion that we should make space for people to endeavor to do better. And long story short, did not do anything about this racist volunteer. Furthermore, the new director also said that at the bottom here, we're working on policies regarding, we're working on behavioral policies for volunteers. And as we have more time, this will become a priority. I can tell you that now, 18 months later, there are no policies in place at this library regarding the behavior of volunteers. So To paraphrase Marvin Gaye, what's going on here? Well, there are a few things. These decisions are political. Both Colin and Tom, the sexual harasser that I mentioned, were white men in their 70s. And older adults, especially white older adults in my community, the community I was serving at that time, were a powerful voting bloc. The median age of folks in this community is 44. I'm in the Austin metro area, in the tippy top of it, at the northernmost area, if you're familiar with Texas at all. The Austin metro area has a median age of 30. So we're in a much older community. A lot of favors are done for older folks in the community that I was serving at this time. This lack of action was political because of the power that older white folks, especially older white men in my community, possess. It was money driven. You can probably guess who donates a lot of money to this library. White folks in their 70s. So kicking somebody out of their volunteer gig over racist language would probably not have gone over well with some donors. And so I think this was also a money-driven decision. I think this is a crystallized example of white supremacy. This is the prioritization of the entitlement of older white men that sacrifices the psychological safety and potentially the physical safety that we heard about this from Beth, right? This sacrifices the psychological and potentially physical safety of vulnerable populations, in this case, Asian Americans, at the feet of the entitlement of white men. This is keeping with the status quo, the way we've always done it, right? We make political decisions based on money, and we often protect white supremacy. And to be completely frank with you, I think this was a cowardly decision. I think that hate speech in the workplace from a volunteer, removal of that volunteer is an easy decision, in my opinion. I struggle to see how this decision could be difficult. And it was for two library directors. And I think that their lack of action, frankly, was cowardly. And I find it really disappointing. So when I think about libraries and public institutions more generally, I think that the job of public institutions, including libraries, is to keep our residents safe and informed. I think that's really the job of government, to keep folks safe and informed, especially vulnerable people. And who am I talking about when I use the phrase vulnerable or vulnerable patron? This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I'm talking about folks with low incomes, older folks who don't have a lot of support, a lot of friends in their lives, folks with physical or mental health challenges, people experiencing homelessness, children, members of marginalized and oppressed populations, including people of color, including indigenous folks, queer folks, victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. When I was working directly with library patrons, about 12% of the folks that I worked with volunteered histories of domestic violence, of being victims of domestic violence. They volunteered it. I usually was not asking outright. That's the floor. So if we can assume, at least here in my community in Texas, USA, that a minimum of what's that? I think 16% or something like that of the folks that we interact with have been at some point victims of domestic violence. And also, I think that people, as you heard from Beth just a few minutes ago, folks who have significant trauma histories are also vulnerable as well. And like I said, this list unfortunately could go on and on, but these are the folks that I think of. Vulnerable patrons are people whose basic needs are not being met by the existing resources in our community. And I think that the library is a protective factor, as I said earlier, for all people, but particularly for these folks. And if you're not familiar with this term, here in the U.S., we have an agency in the federal government called the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. And they describe protective factors as characteristics associated with a lower likelihood of negative outcomes or that reduce a risk factor's impact. So you might think of growing up in a two-parent household, having nutritious food on the table, having consistent access to transportation. All those are protective factors. Protective factors include the theater class that you took in high school that kept you from smoking too much pot, the friend that shows up on your doorstep with a pizza and a bottle of wine after you have a really hard day. These are all protective factors. And in my mind, the library is a protective factor for all our patrons, but particularly for vulnerable people. Those of you who are social workers, or really anybody who took intro psychology, maybe in high school or university, will recognize this triangle on the right as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you don't, Maslow was an early psychologist, and he theorized that in order for us to reach our full potential, or what he called self-actualization, we essentially needed to climb this pyramid or this triangle, starting at the bottom. And you can see here that many public libraries, at least here in the States, provide a lot of this stuff, right? Physiological needs, most of our libraries are safe and warm in the winter and cool in the summer, and they have water, and some even have food or food pantries. Most of our libraries are safe most of the time. Relationships happen in our libraries, sometimes between staff and patron, but in my experience, more often between patron and patron. You know, people that use the library 5, 6, 7 days a week tend to identify one another and start talking. And I think that's a beautiful thing about public libraries, is the organic facilitation of friendships and intimacy. We might even be able to provide for feelings of accomplishment. A library I used to work at, we would have art shows for community members. So older adults, people with developmental disabilities, we would have art shows, and we would put their art on our wall. And that wasn't necessarily accessible to every single person in the community because we only have so much space on the wall. But that there were opportunities for us to provide feelings of esteem and prestige to folks. And so something that I think a lot of administrators misunderstand when they are considering partnering with a helping professional or a helping agency, or hiring a social worker like me, is that I think that a lot of administrators expect that we are somehow going to keep people experiencing homelessness out of the library, that they will stop coming to the library if we get them housed. Or sometimes they think that we're going to run interference between people with serious mental illness and the rest of the library staff, and somehow take folks with mental illness off the customer service plate, so to speak. And that could not be more wrong. The library is a protective factor in the lives of vulnerable people. And as such, especially here in Texas, where the heat can literally kill you, as I suspect it can in Australia as well, I am not going to try to tell people to stay away from the library. I'm going to invite them in more and more. The very first question I always asked myself when I was in the library, and I was considering how or if to approach a person, was, is what I'm about to do going to increase or decrease the likelihood that this person comes back tomorrow? I want them to come back tomorrow. And this confused a lot of staff, because they would think, why isn't Patrick walking up to that person who's obviously experiencing homelessness? Because that person didn't ask to speak to me. And that person is aware that I'm here in the building. And I want that person to come back. If I'm up in his business, asking him questions, being nosy, is that person going to come back tomorrow? Maybe not. But if I respect that person's autonomy, they may come back. And that person needs to come back because of the resources contained within the building and the fact that this building is literally protective of that person. And so I think by virtue of the fact that we're all here right now, we probably all agree, or maybe even have experienced the library as life-changing. But I'm here to tell you that libraries can also be life-saving when it comes to vulnerable people. And when I deliver this spiel, to folks to library professionals. Sometimes they'll say some version of, but that's not what libraries are for, and maybe make a face like this. And my response to that is, at a time when books and movies and media and music and research are all available right here, why do we have the buildings? I can assure you that here in the state of Texas, our state leadership, the politicians, would love nothing more than to sell the land that our libraries sit on, to fire most of the librarians, and to put libraries 100% online. And then they could go to their constituents and say, look, I'm a real fiscal conservative. I'm saving tax dollars. But they don't do it, right? We keep the libraries around. Why? Because libraries are about people, not books. We got books here, but we still like to gather in public spaces. Libraries are about people, not books. And when it comes to social workers, and I think also librarians, that when library work is at its best, our work requires trust and connection with the people that we serve. Librarians' work requires, I think, trust and connection with the people in the communities that they serve. In my opinion, building trust and connection requires us to sometimes be vulnerable, right? If I go up to somebody who's having a hard time and I'm wearing a three-piece suit and I got my hair slicked back and a Rolex on my wrist and I'm projecting very strong, I know what I'm doing all of the time, are they going to really feel safe with me? I don't think so. I think that we have to show bits and pieces of ourselves to the folks that we serve to build connection with them. And that requires courage. At an institutional level, when you're trying to change an institution and reframe, as Beth said a few minutes ago, the work, you're opening yourself up for criticism from your city council, the board at the library, your powerful patrons, any number of people. It requires courage to try and change the work that we do in new and perhaps a little bit scary ways. Vulnerability, in my opinion, requires courage. It's about balance. So much of this work for me is about balance. And libraries are changing, right? I mean, we're here because libraries are changing, right? There are social workers moving into libraries. Libraries are considering things like anti-racism and de-escalation and these sorts of things. And as libraries become interdisciplinary spaces, we're running into some challenges. I think that my experience has been, and unfortunately many of my colleagues' experience has been here in the United States, is that I don't think a lot of library administrators appreciate the heavy lift that it takes to invite a social worker to come on staff or to contract and come work in your library regularly. In my opinion, when an institution chooses to become interdisciplinary, it's essentially an invitation to the new professional to say, hey, we want to tweak how we do our work. We want your input. We value you as an expert in your area of expertise, and we want you to come in and reframe what we do. But that's often not what we see. We see what I talked about earlier. We want you to keep those people out of the library. We want you to keep those people away from the service desk. And again, that is not what this is about. I want libraries to become truly interdisciplinary. I want the social workers on staff, if libraries are lucky enough to have one, I want that social worker to be part of the hiring team. I want that social worker to be part of policy development. I want that social worker to be part of training staff. You cannot put us in the back corner, what I call the slow cooker method, right? We keep our slow cookers or our crock pots in the back of the cabinet, and we pull it out occasionally, and we got a tough cut of meat, and then we stick it back in the cabinet. That is not how this collaboration should work. The social workers, the helping professionals that are invited into the library to become interdisciplinary need to be involved in the running of the library. All of this said, I really think that social work is at its best when it's subversive. What do I mean by subversive? I mean, kind of what I did with those emails a few minutes ago, flying under the radar of the powers that be and working hard to improve the lives of the individuals and the communities that we serve. We're going to rock the boat. If you are considering a social work or social work-ish collaboration at your library, you need to be prepared for the boat to rock, period. Any social worker worth a damn is going to come in and rock the boat. You got to be prepared for that. And as you can probably guess, we're going to challenge status quo, certainly. In my opinion, the fact that social work exists is unfortunate, right? The fact that we, in a more perfect world, the problems that we help people with would be solved by friends, family, and community, right? I want to work myself out of a job. I want to make it so that social work is no longer required in our society. We're going to challenge the status quo. In large part because the status quo ain't working so good, right? I think it's a pretty dark time for many of us, certainly here in the United States. It's a very dark time. And I don't want to get too hyperbolic here, but we got to rethink the way we do things as human beings, not just as social workers, not just as librarians, but I think we got to rethink the way we do stuff, right? We've got, just like here in the United States, it looks like y'all are having some issues with homelessness. Here in my country, I assume Australia as well, housing costs have ballooned astronomically. In my community, the houses around me that I can see out my window are cost 40% more than they did 2 years ago. And again, not to go too far here, but the ocean's on fire, or it was, right? I think that there's something really powerful about the metaphor of spraying water into the ocean that speaks to me about our adherence to status quo, right? We're spraying water into the ocean to try to solve a problem that we created, right? We got to start thinking differently. We cannot do stuff in our libraries, in our lives, in the world the way it's always been done, because it's not working. So I think that many library patrons sometimes need social workers, but I'm going to tell you that I think all libraries need social workers. See the difference there? We can serve library patrons. Sometimes they might not need our services, but I think that public institutions, especially libraries, need social workers. They need our unusual voices. They need our codes of ethics. They need our social work values. If you are a library administrator and you are considering bringing someone like me on staff or to partner with your agency, you need to look at the social work code of ethics. I believe in Australia, that's going to be the Australian Association of Social Work has a code of ethics. Here in the United States, it's the National Association of Social Workers. Those are the dominant codes of ethics. There are many, but those are the dominant ones. And I suspect that librarians in Australia, just like librarians in the US, have their own codes of ethics. We need to be in the building. And you need to look at those codes of ethics because they can conflict. Here in the United States, the American Library Association code says you need to be politically neutral. The NASW code, the social work code, says we must fight racism. In some communities, unfortunately, those two things conflict. And those are things that library administrators need to consider before hiring folks like us or bringing us on in other capacities. And I think that it really behooves the communities we serve to have social workers, to have our unusual voices in the room, because we're going to hold the feet of the powerful people to the fire, right? When we're talking about status quo, we're talking about public institutions, we're talking about government employees, right? Typically, people don't climb the ladder within government by rocking the boat. Boat rockers are rarely promoted to ship captain, but we need boat rockers to help us drive our work forward to serve our communities in new and better ways. And a lot of the folks who have benefited from status quo, who played by the rules and got into a position that pays them more, offers them status, offers them power. We're living in a dark time. Status quo is dark right now, right? We need to come in, we need to be that light in the dark. We need to shine a light in the places where vulnerable people dwell and are unseen by people with privilege like me, right? We need to be there to reshape the way that our libraries serve folks, to shine that light and to help our institutions think differently about the ways that we serve our patrons and our communities. So with that, I am happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That's a fantastic presentation, and you've created a great deal of chat and thumbs up and claps and things from all of us. So thank you so much for that. We do have some questions in the Q&A. If anyone does have others, please pop them in, and we've got about 10 minutes to work through these. So firstly, a question from the Mount Roskill Library. Not sure where that is. I think it sounds like an Australian place. Do you have any guidance or advice for how we balance making the library a safe space for all and provide access to collections with potentially harmful content? So I imagine the example here is racist or transphobic books. Hopefully there aren't too many of those in the libraries, but perhaps books that some people might find difficult, and other people doesn't occur to them that there's a problem there.
Yeah. So, I mean, keep in mind that as a social worker, I have no experience with collection development or weeding or anything like that. So take this with a grain of salt. I think that, we may be hamstrung into putting certain books on our shelves at times, but I think that we have a lot of control over what books we choose to promote and what kind of displays we get to create and the ways we treat people. And if we are directed to have or asked to carry troubling books, perhaps we put them on the shelf, we don't promote them, and then it gets checked out once, and then we weed it and just get rid of it. Again, I have no experience with the minutia of what it means to have to put certain books on the shelf, but I would say that if you're in a situation in which you have to put harmful literature on the shelves, that I would keep it as quiet as possible and take it down as soon as you can.
Yeah, good answer. And another one from Sarah Mangley, and this is like a social work type question. She's wondering how you manage clinical supervision for social workers in libraries, if they are, in particular, if they're the only one working in that space. It's hard for me to answer this question without knowing where the person who's writing it is, and also the regulations as far as who gets to call themselves a licensed social worker in that state or country. So that said, what can happen is that interns or folks who are chasing their clinical licensure would have to seek out essentially off-site supervision. So they might be working in the day-to-day in a particular library, but then once a week they leave and go to their supervisor, who may be off-site or at another office or what have you, and receive supervision there. I've been an off-site supervisor. This is just a reality of social work. It does happen. It's not ideal. Certainly, I think supervision is at its best when supervisor and supervisee are speaking the same language and understand the context of the work similarly. But that is a workaround. Certainly, I would not discourage if anyone is considering bringing on a social worker, but is holding back because of a lack of another social worker on staff to provide supervision. I would say don't let that discourage you. Reach out. I would start with either if you have a social work association in your area, reach out to them, or if you're lucky enough to have a university with a school of social work in your area, reach out to them. And I think that one of those two avenues should get you an answer to this problem. Great, thank you. And I was wondering too, from the reading that I've been doing about social workers in libraries, there seems to be some questions about the best sort of physical arrangement of it. Do you put a social worker in an office to maintain privacy, but then perhaps be not visible enough? Or do you have them out on the floor, but then maybe compromise patron privacy?
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion about what works best in that situation?
Yeah, this is a hard question. I don't think there's a right answer. Unfortunately, when I was working in the library myself, I was never provided an office of any kind, which is very difficult. If I had what I wanted was to have an office on the floor with glass walls, but frosted glass walls. What I wanted was to be able to maintain some level of privacy for the patrons I was talking to, while allowing enough visibility so that if I was in there by myself, patrons could see that there was someone in the office, or that I could open the door or something like that. So that's the best I've come up with. I know a lot of it depends on the space and it depends on the budget, and there's any number of variables that come into play. But when I was advocating for an office, that's what I was after. Another consideration is the mobility of patrons. Depending on who the demographics of the community that you serve. Again, I mentioned earlier that I was serving an older community. So I wanted my office, that never happened, but I wanted my office on the first floor, right? Because I want it accessible to people who may have mobility challenges, but I also just wanted to be visible to patrons in general.
Yeah, great. And we've got a couple of questions here, a few minutes to do this. So social workers need to run for board positions. Oh, this is a comment from the chat. Yeah. Have you ever thought of working at those levels, Patrick? So be the person writing the policies.
Well, in my experience, the policies come from the municipality or from the staff itself, not from the board. So this may be a community very different from the one that I've served. I have occasionally thought about applying to serve on a library board. The library board, the only library in the city that I live in, is the one that I used to work at, and I just shared those emails earlier. So I'm not optimistic about my ability to sway that library director. I have thought about it in the past, and it may be something that I take up in the future, but it's not on my agenda in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, thank you. And another one here, can you or someone in the conference offer guidance on initiating social worker in library programs in areas where this doesn't exist? So yes, I think this is like real starting off, getting it going from nothing. What are any recommendations?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think my recommendations are so much that we don't have time. So I please, whoever wrote that and anyone else who is wondering that same question, please email me, because I have lots and lots of stuff to send you. When I was part of the PLA social worker task force, we did a lot of work around this, and I can send you some of our guidance for this sort of stuff.
That'd be terrific. And another question here about the advantages and disadvantages of providing the sort of support that a social worker can do, face-to-face versus online.
Well, I think that when it comes to library social work, that we're more often than not meeting people in the building. And so I would say that is my preference. In my experience, most of the vulnerable people coming to libraries are coming there physically because they need a safe place, because they need a cool place or a hot place, depending on the seat, or warm place in the winter. And so face-to-face is I think going to be much more effective in general. I struggle to think of I kind of, like Beth, had a similar question at the end of her talk. And I've never experienced a library social worker who operates primarily online. I've been a recipient of online therapy, but that is not typically what library social workers are doing, right? Our libraries aren't community resource provider, or they aren't nonprofits, they aren't therapists. I may be a social worker, but as a library social worker, I'm not necessarily providing therapy. So I'm not quite sure how to address the online piece, other than to say face-to-face is my preference.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got 1 minute left and one more question I think we can fit in. When you were working, in particular when you were in the libraries, were you also training or working with library staff to upskill them, or were you working just directly with clients?
I was working with library staff as well. Unfortunately, as you can tell from this talk, the buy-in from the administration regarding my work and social work in general never quite caught on the way that I had hoped. And I was not able to train library and staff in that library as often or as thoroughly as I would have liked. But I was able to train them, sometimes formally in sessions like this, and in a lot of informal coaching, kind of in the break room, by the water cooler, at lunch, lots and lots of informal coaching at those times. And I've been very, very lucky over the past 4 years or so to have been able to do this kind of thing all over the United States and now here in Australia. So I've done lots and lots of training for librarians and library staff around the world. But when I was sitting in the library, unfortunately, I was not able to train staff as much as I would have liked, or perhaps as much as they would have liked. I think that, again, the lack of buy-in, tight schedules, tight budgets, it made it hard.
Terrific. All right, well, we'll have to leave it there, but you've got Patrick's email, and I'm sure if people have got extra questions, they can send that through to you. So thank you so much for your time. It's really great to hear from you, and thank you for staying up to be part of this.
It's only 7 p.m. We're all right.
Oh, that's okay. Oh, you're right. You've got time to watch the football from here.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so our next speaker is Mary Province, who I see is here. Mary, if you want to have a go at sharing your screen, we'll just make sure that's all working fine.